On June 9, 2026, U.S. Central Command struck a Palau-flagged oil tanker in the Gulf of Oman, accusing it of smuggling Iranian crude. The attack on the MT Settebello killed 3 Indian sailors, Aditya Sharma, Shivanand Chaurasiya, and Patnala Suresh. New Delhi did not immediately condemn the strike. It took days for External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar to lodge a formal protest with the U.S. Secretary of State, a strong protest delivered through back channels that described the deaths as avoidable. This response differed sharply from an incident weeks prior. When Iran fired on an Indian-flagged ship, the government summoned Iran's ambassador immediately and issued a series of blunt public condemnations. Both events involved violent attacks on ships with Indian crews in the same conflict zone, yet the diplomatic reaction changed based on which military pulled the trigger. This selective silence raises a question about how the world's most populous democracy balances the safety of its citizens against the requirements of its most powerful allies. India's current strategic goals rely heavily on the United States. Washington is now India's largest trading partner and its primary source for the defense technology New Delhi needs to counter China's regional influence. The timing of the conflict also created a difficult diplomatic situation. On February 25, 2026, Prime Minister Narendra Modi arrived in Israel for a state visit, just 48 hours before the U.S. and Israel began their strikes on Iran. During that visit, Modi and Benjamin Netanyahu elevated their ties to a special strategic partnership. Having just declared India's full conviction alongside Israel, the government was poorly positioned to issue a forceful condemnation of the strikes that followed. New Delhi calculated that its long-term goals with Washington and Tel Aviv were too significant to risk. A quiet protest satisfied domestic requirements without rupturing the broader alliance. India imports 88% of its crude oil, leaving its economy highly vulnerable to supply disruptions. 40% of these imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. Following Iran's closure of the strait, India depends on U.S. military presence to manage regional security and reopen the waterway. India's exposure in the region is further defined by the 9.3 million Indian nationals currently living and working across the Gulf countries. This population remits over $51 billion annually, providing a critical buffer for India's foreign exchange reserves. Their safety and economic contributions depend on regional stability that India cannot enforce on its own. Provoking Washington risks the cooperation needed to protect this diaspora. India's restraint is a reflection of the fact that 9 million citizens and the national energy grid are effectively tied to U.S. military policy in the Gulf. The response to the MT Settebello follows a pattern established earlier in the war. In March 2026, a U.S. submarine sank the Iranian frigate IRS Dina off the coast of Sri Lanka, killing more than 100 sailors. The IRS Dina was hit while sailing home from Visakhapatnam, where it had been a guest of the Indian Navy during multilateral fleet exercises. Although Iran pointedly reminded the world that the ship was India's guest, the Indian government issued no public condemnation of the U.S. strike. By remaining silent after the sinking of a guest vessel, New Delhi demonstrated that it would prioritize its U.S. alignment over traditional diplomatic protocols, paving the way for the muted response when its own sailors were killed months later. The defense of New Delhi's restraint is rooted in realism. As a middle power navigating a conflict between major regional and global players, India lacks the leverage to stop the violence and must prioritize its immediate national security. This diagram represents strategic autonomy, the long-standing doctrine of maintaining independent, parallel relationships with competing powers like the US, Russia, and Iran simultaneously. However, recent silence has fractured that balance. Relations with Tehran have cooled, as Iran pointedly notes India's lack of support, and New Delhi has found itself unable to reach a consensus on a joint statement with its partners in the BRICS bloc. This shift affects India's standing as a representative for the global South. The gap between its aspirations to be a world teacher and its quietude during the deaths of its citizens suggests a limit to its diplomatic independence. There is also a cost to the trust of its own workforce. For Indian sailors operating in dangerous waters, the government's response suggests that strategic interests may carry more weight than the lives of individual citizens. The MT Settebello incident provides a look at New Delhi's current priorities, where the preservation of a primary strategic partnership carries more weight than the traditional diplomatic defense of its own citizens.